We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Those words were in the Declaration of Independence, written 245 years ago by Thomas Jefferson.
Well, we now interpret the words all men to refer to all men and women in the early days of our country. They were referring specifically to white, land-owning men, usually Christian and over 21 years old.
For centuries, only these men were allowed to vote. Yet other Americans still had to pay taxes. If they paid taxes to the government, shouldn't they have a say in the government?
How far would you go to fight for a cause that you believed in? Would you be willing to be arrested, beaten, publicly humiliated?
Thousands of people in American history were willing to make those sacrifices, all for the right to vote.
Luckily, they were willing to stand up for what they believed in, because today, we now have the rights that they fought for.
Whether we are male or female, rich or poor, black, white, or purple with pink spots, when we turn 18, we will all have the right and responsibility to vote. In remembrance of those brave souls who earned us that right, please join us in saluting our flag. Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
In 1846, the Women's First Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. There, both men and women wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. In it, it stated that all men and women were created equal, and that the women should have the right to vote.
One group of people who felt strongly about being allowed to vote was women.
You might wonder why it's so controversial to allow women to vote, but society was very different in the early days of the United States and throughout the 18 and 1900s.
Some people felt allowing women to vote would lead the United States to follow democracy and into socialism. Others felt it would undermine the role of husbands being the head of the family.
Some people also thought that if women had the right to vote, then the government would enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote after the Civil War. They thought it would interfere with states' rights.
Women, known as suffragists, came together to peacefully protest for the right to vote. The term suffrage has nothing to do with suffering. Instead, it comes from a Latin word, suffragium, meaning the right or privilege to vote.
These women and many men protested, made speeches, and participated in marches to bring awareness to the issue of allowing women to vote. They knew it wouldn't be a fast or easy task.
The suffragists broke into two groups. One group, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, believed changes had to come from a constitutional amendment, while the other group, led by Lucy Stone and Alice Paul, felt changes had to come from the state level.
Susan B. Anthony and 14 other women registered in New York and voted for Ulysses S. Grant in the election of 1871. She was arrested, tried, and convicted. While the defense tried to invoke the 14th Amendment, the argument was not successful.
The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born in the United States, and to grant citizenship and all its rights to former enslaved people. However, it was ruled that its rights did not extend to women's right to vote.
Whether or not women could vote was left up to the individual states.
Last year, on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, President Trump posthumously pardoned Miss Anthony's conviction.
This means that her crime was forgiven even though she died a long time ago. Alice Paul was well educated with a doctorate in sociology and was determined to win the vote by any means. She even organized an enormous suffrage parade that coincided and distracted from the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson.
Oops! The suffragists picketed peacefully in front of the White House for several months, even when the United States entered World War I. However, 6 months into the protests, Russian dignitaries visited the White House, and the display of protest embarrassed President Wilson.
The D.C. police arrested the protesters. Oddly though, the women didn't mind, because they knew the arrest would give them news coverage and draw more attention to their cause.
The police didn't know what crimes to charge them with, so they were all charged with illegally obstructing traffic. They were all released. This went on day after day, as the suffragists would march with banners to the White House, get arrested, then released. This became a daily spectacle as people would gather to watch the suffragists. People began to empathize with the suffragists as they'd watch police officers forcibly wrench signs and banners from not only young women, but white-haired, frail grandmothers.
The women wore white, a symbol of purity, to represent that women would vote for candidates who would best serve society. Their white dresses were in sharp contrast to the dark red suits of the onlookers.
The suffragists also used the colors purple, white, and gold on flags and banners. Purple represented loyalty, white, purity, and gold, the color of light and life, the torch that guides our purpose, pure and unswerving. These women were nicknamed the Silent Sentinels, but eventually authorities grew tired of this protest, and once they were arrested, they weren't released after a few hours.
In all, 218 suffragists spent time in jail and endured horrific, inhumane treatment, including rats in cells, worms in food, and even physical abuse.
Some women filed complaints about the harsh treatment, while others decided to go on hunger strikes to gain attention to the appalling conditions. Many of the hunger strikers were often brutally force-fed.
In motion for a wellness check, a judge finally ruled that the woman had indeed been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the United States Constitution.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we tried to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. Yeah, but you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, shoot some men back down and call us missing. Yeah, let's hang the watch out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolls around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, cause I'm going downtown to ask my vote for president. But we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we're cool down on the lever. Cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Who break the vote, who took the ticket, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross and so flag was left behind that first election there. Then Susan B. Anthony, and Julia Howe, who preach your life. They showed us how they carried signs and marched the lines until as long as the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we cool down on the lever. Cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. In the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Since 1920, Sisters Unite.
Public opinion nationwide began to turn in the suffragists' favor. 144 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, President Wilson publicly supported the suffrage amendment, and in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, allowing white women in every state the right to vote.
When Tennessee Representative Harry T. Byrne received a letter from his mother telling him to be a good boy and vote for suffrage, he changed his vote, making Tennessee the 36th state to vote for suffrage and ratify it into law. Now, every other state had to legally allow women to vote. However, Native American women were still not permitted to vote until 1924 and 1952 for Asian women.
On November 2nd, 1920, over 8 million women showed up at poll booths for the first time ever to exercise their right to vote.
Eventually, all 50 states did pass the 19th Amendment, even though it was already a law. Mississippi was the last state to ratify it in 1984.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Alice leaders, reflecting the traits of determination, perseverance, and courage. The two that fought the longest, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, did not live long enough to cast a ballot themselves.
"1920 is only a small part of the story. These women and so many other leaders throughout history have taught us how important it is to empathize with others' struggles and to simply treat everyone with equality and dignity.
What's important for us to remember from their work is to not take for granted the rights we all have and to treat all people with respect.
What do you want? Baby, I got it. What do you need? Do you know I got it? All I'm asking is for a little respect. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. I ain't gonna get wrong when I go. I ain't gonna be wrong 'cause I don't wanna. All I'm asking is for a little respect, just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, take care of TCB. Go, 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 respect, just a little bit. We are tired, just a little bit. Keep on trying, just a little bit. Just a little bit, we're not lying, just a little bit. R-E-S-P-E-C-T.
Thank you for joining us in celebrating the 101st anniversary of the Women's Right to Vote. We'd like to thank Mrs. Gamazzo and Mrs. Page for their amazing efforts.
We would also like to express our thanks to Mr. Conchar and a big shout out to our parents for their support. With a note of thanks to Ms. Pascolo and Mrs. Bedoin for helping us with our decorations.
Ms. Kennedy?
Everybody, we've learned so much today. Thank you so much. We also need to give a huge thank you to Ms. Brennan. Thank you.